Broadly speaking, there are two views of human society. Conservatives believe that what we've done in the past is the best possible solution to any problem. Progressives always ask the question, can we do this better? It's important to keep in mind that all human progress comes from asking this question. During the French Revolution, the conservatives, who supported the monarchy, the nobility, and the wealthy, sat on the right side of the king. Meanwhile, supporters of progressive causes sat on the left side of the king. Ever since then, conservative viewpoints have been called right-wing, and progressive viewpoints have been called left-wing. This leads to spatial models of voting behavior. In a spatial model, we assume that voters and candidates are located somewhere in a policy space, and that voters will support candidates closest to them in that policy space. So to begin with, we might imagine the policy space to be a one-dimensional line, where voters and candidates are somewhere along the line. This is consistent with our left-right political spectrum. So, for example, we might imagine a bunch of voters A through H located along a one-dimensional policy space, and a couple of candidates X, Y, and Z located someplace else. So we might take a look at voter A and see which candidate they would support, and which candidate voter D would support. So, of our candidates X, Y, and Z, X is closest to A's position, so A would support X. D is located between candidates X and Y, but they're closer to Y, so D would support Y. We could also have a two-dimensional policy space. As before, voters or candidates are somewhere in the space, and they support the candidates closest to their own positions. And we can even have higher dimensional spaces even though we can't draw them. For example, a two-dimensional model might incorporate social and economic values. A person could be socially conservative and want to limit voting rights to straight white men because that's how things were in the 1850s, and back then things were, of course, perfect. But they might be economically progressive and support things like universal basic income. Rather surprisingly, there were actually people who promoted this in the 1850s. Or they might be socially progressive and support the rights of all people, but oppose minimum wages, taxes, and any regulation on any industry. So let's consider a two-dimensional policy space shown with voters in lowercase and candidates in uppercase, and let's try to decide which voters support which candidates. So our candidates are capital X, Y, and Z, and we see here that voters A, B, and C are obviously closer to X than to anyone else. E and H are closer to Z than anyone else. And D, F, and G are closer to Y than anyone else. If voters and candidates are placed in a policy space, we can recover voter rankings of all candidates. The most preferred candidate is the closest, the least preferred is the farthest, and the other candidates are preferred in order of increasing distance. We'll use the notation P preferred over Q to indicate a preference of candidate P over candidate Q. So going back to our one-dimensional policy space, we might ask how voters C and F rank the three candidates, and see if we can find voters with preference ranking Z over Y over X, and Z over X over Y. So if we take a look at voter C, we see they're closest to X, and Y is closer to them than Z. So their preference is X over Y over Z. Now for voter F, Y is the closest, and now Z is closer than X. So their preference ranking is Y over Z over X. For a voter to have preference Z over Y over X, they'd need to be closest to Z with Y closer than X. And this is going to be true for voters G and H. Meanwhile, for a voter to have preference Z over X over Y, they need to be closest to Z with X closer than Y. But in our one-dimensional policy space, that's not possible since X is on the other side of Y. So any voter that's closest to X is automatically going to be closer to Y than they are to X, so no voter can have this ranking. Or again, we could look at our two-dimensional policy space and ask the same questions, how different voters would rank the candidates, and ask whether there could be voters with certain preferences. So for voter C, X is the closest, and Z is closer than Y, so their preference would be X over Z over Y. For voter F, Y is the closest, and Z is closer than X, so their preference would be Y over Z over X. To have preference Z over Y over X, a voter would be closest to Z and nearer to Y than X. And note that voters E and H are in this situation where they're closest to Z, but Y is closer to them than X is. To have preference Z over X over Y, a voter would need to be closest to Z and closer to X than to Y. While none of the voters shown have this situation, it's possible if a voter is somewhere between X and Z, but closer to Z.